Welcome to Lingthusiasm, a podcast that's enthusiastic about linguistics. I'm Gretchen McCulloch.
And I'm Lauren Gawne, and today we're getting enthusiastic about linguistics in 100 different ways for our 100th episode. But first, thanks for joining us for this very special round number episode.
Whether this is your first or 100th episode of Lingthusiasm or anywhere in between, we're delighted by your enthusiasm for linguistics.
Our most recent bonus episode was deleted scenes from interviews, including talking to Jack Jones about linguistics crafting, chatting Gavagai with Tom Scott, and a discussion about computational linguistics and language documentation with Emily Bender.
The support of our patrons and your enthusiasm for our bonus episodes on Patreon has been the way that we funded the show for the first 100 episodes, and your continued support will help us make many more.
For this bonus episode and over 90 other bonus episodes, go to patreon.com/Lingthusiasm.
This is our 100th episode of Lingthusiasm. We should do something special to celebrate.
Oh yeah, we could do an episode on the linguistics of time words like month or year.
I think we've done that. But what if we do like tense and how time works in grammar?
We've done that too. We could do numbers.
No, we've done numbers in a bonus episode. Besides, how are we supposed to pick just one favorite topic?
When it comes to linguistics, maybe our favorite topic is all of them.
I remember when I was first learning linguistics and feeling like I was constantly having my mind expanded by so many things that I didn't know about languages and how they fit in the world.
Oh yes, I love those moments where you're just like, aha, this is cool. And so we pulled together 100 linguistics facts for our 100th episode.
Featuring some Lingthusiasm classics, things from previous episodes that either stood out to us or people on social media told us were especially memorable, and maybe some things that might show up in expanded form in future episodes.
One thing we've also loved across the last 100 episodes have been the amazing guest interviews we've done. And so we're also excited to share some facts from previous guests on the show, which they've sent along to help us celebrate.
We'd love to hear from you too. What's a quick fact, example, story, other thing related to linguistics that made you go, whoa, or that you like sharing with people, whether it's already in this episode or something we haven't gotten to yet.
And maybe that will help more people find the show for episode 200.
Dreaming big. Okay, fact number 1, everyone has an accent.
Fact 2. There's no single agreed upon definition of what a word is.
Or, for that matter, what a language is.
These words are hard to define because they're much more nuanced and multi-featured in context.
This is actually also how most words work. Mm-hmm. So there's a gap between how we come to understand the meaning of a word, which is generally through lots of different examples of a dog or a bird or a tree or a chair, and then how we try to pin that down by trying to unite some of the features of those examples for what they have in common.
I think we'll just make it a single fact rather than having 100 facts that say a hot dog is or isn't a sandwich, or there's no such thing as a fish/tree/grass.
Yeah, well, you can move on to some other domains. Keeping things varied.
Fact 7. Writing was only invented 3 or 4 times, which always seems to me like fewer times or maybe more times than I would have expected.
Yeah, because if it was invented one time 6,000 years ago and then just expanded, you'd have this sort of single happenstance origin story. Or if it had been invented dozens and dozens of times throughout the course of history, then yeah, sure, writing just pops up all over the place. But this like tantalizing 3 or 4 times, depending on whether you think that the, last 2 were related to each other or different origins, that's tantalizing.
Instead, they were all invented around 6,000 years ago in Mesoamerica, Mesopotamia, and ancient China.
And we don't know how old language is because words coming out of your mouth, signs on your hands, don't leave fossils the way writing does. But it's at least like 10 times older than writing.
The earliest writing systems, though, didn't use punctuation like many modern systems do. And in the Western tradition, it started for Greek actors to better read the scripts that they were reading.
One interesting character at the intersection of writing sounds and punctuation is the Hawaiian okina, which was mentioned to us by former guest Tom Scott, who points out that it's often rendered identical to an opening curved single quotation mark, or even sometimes an apostrophe, which is what people often type because that's easier, but it's actually a completely different character that's sometimes sort of like a small c. And the equivalent in the Tahitian language, the eta, doesn't even get a Unicode character. This shape is linked to the Arabic character Hamza, which also has this sort of like high up in the air C-ish shape thing, and can be traced back to Phoenician, where the character Aleph was used to express both the glottal stop, which is this sound that's in Hawaii, or this sound that's also in Arabic, and was used in Arabic to express this consonant sound, the glottal stop, and also the long vowel ah, which is what a modern Aleph, alpha, letter A all represent the sound of the vowel version rather than this sort of hidden consonant one.
The Lingthusiasm logo is also in the shape of a glottal stop from the International Phonetic Alphabet.
That's true. On the topic of Unicode characters, emoji are also in Unicode.
Yep. And we proposed the peeking eye emoji along with our internet friend Jennifer Daniel for next time you use that on your internet keyboard.
Think of Lingthusiasm.
The word sneeze in Middle English was actually written fneeze, and it's just that fn looks a bit like that long S that's used in old printed English, and so people read fn but thought they were reading sn, and that's how we get sneeze.
You told me this fact, Lauren, years ago, and I'm still not over fneeze.
Fneeze.
The one that got me when I was taking intro linguistics was that the word knee in English used to be pronounced kne, and that's why it's still spelled that way.
The word spell, as in to spell out the sounds of a word, and the word spell to cast a spell are etymologically related because writing was seen as quite mystical, and that's how spells were created.
Speaking of silent spelling, one of the facts that has stood out to several people who've listened to this podcast is that the French circumflex accent, that's the one that looks like a little hat, often denotes an S that became silent and then invisible, which explains a lot of doublets that were borrowed from French into English before this S became silent.
Right.
So you have pairs like hotel and hostel, forêt and forest, côté and coast, pâté and paste.
Oh, yes.
And all of these have this silent S that has become a circumflex in French, and the S is still produced La Belle et la Bête, Beauty and the Beast. Fest and fiesta and fête are all from that origin.
Double borrowing gives us shirt and skirt, which both come from the same root, but shirt was in Old English and underwent a sound change, and then we borrowed back in skirt from Old Norse, which had not been through that same sound change process, to refer to a different item of clothing.
This is also not entirely an etymology podcast, but I do want to point out that the word calc is a loan word for French, where it means to translate each of the items of a loan literally. So like a skyscraper is a gratte-ciel, which literally means it scrapes the sky. But loan word itself is a calc, this literal translation of the German word Lehnwert, which means that calc is a loan word because it was borrowed directly from French and wasn't translated piece by piece. But loan word, which is a calc.
I don't know if that's confusing or satisfying. I think both. When we misanalyze a word in English and think that it actually has the shape of another word, this is known as an eggcorn because of an example where someone had the word acorn and misheard or misunderstood it as eggcorn because it looks like a little egg. But the word eggcorn itself is a double eggcorn because it used to be, before acorn, oakcorn, which makes sense. It comes from an oak tree. I've never understood why oak trees have seeds that aren't called oak seeds. And they used to be oak corn.
Because corn is just any kind of seed.
So it's a double eggcorn.
This is such a satisfying fact because it's like an eggcorn is an eggcorn is an eggcorn.
Our producer, Claire, wanted to share the fact that orange, the word in English, didn't exist until the fruit turned up. The colour that we now think of as orange was just lumped in with red or yellow, depending on the tone.
Which is why in English we say redhead for a person with hair that is really closer to the color orange, We don't say orangehead because people with that hair color have existed speaking English or an ancestor of English longer than the word or color orange has existed in English.
If you ask people where on their face a frown is, Americans are much more likely to say the mouth, while Brits will say the forehead. This explains why some people find the phrase turn that frown upside down confusing, because they don't have the American mouth interpretation. And similarly, it takes more muscles to frown is the British you're moving your forehead a lot interpretation.
Former guest Tiger Webb sent us from 1935 to 37, the BBC formed a subcommittee for the invention of new words, in part to work out what to call people who watched television.
Wait, what do we call them?
Their main suggestion was televiewer, which did not catch on.
Oh, that did not catch on. I guess we do call them viewers or audience?
Definitely not watchers, though, which...
Definitely not watchers.
We could have had watchers.
Will Mahler is an animator who joined us for our discussion of the Tom Scott Language Files videos, and Will has shared an animation-themed turn of phrase, which is the phrase, to bump the lamp, which comes from the 1980s film Who Framed Roger Rabbit, which is live action but with all of these animated characters, and because in one scene, one of the human characters bumps his head on a lamp, it sways and the lighting makes it so much harder to animate, but it was such a dedicated animation team, they went to that extra effort, and that's what bump the lamp means, to go that extra mile in making a creative work satisfying.
On the topic of furniture, one of my favorite linguistic connections is the word canapé.
Okay, the small nibble hors d'oeuvre thing that you get at a fancy party. I don't understand how that's a lounge room etymology.
This is because the French word for couch or sofa is also canapé.
And they're related?
And I had learned the word for you put your little cheese and meats and herbs and stuff, pâté, on a piece of bread or toast or cracker, and then you eat it. But this refers to their toppings are on a little couch of bread.
That is cute and tasty.
Would you like a sofa from this tray?
Since we're talking about delicious things, the English word cheese, the Spanish word queso, the German word Käse, and the Italian word cacio, as in cacio e pepe, one of my favorite pasta dishes. Those are all cheese, and they are all related.
But they've undergone sound change, and this would be less visible if they were written in the International Phonetic Alphabet, which the International Phonetic Alphabet, or IPA, represents all of the sounds in spoken languages that have come to the attention of linguists.
And those linguists who decide what's in the IPA is the International Phonetic Association. So the IPA runs the IPA.
And the IPA journal used to accept submissions entirely written in the International Phonetic Alphabet. So you would read them out in the accent of the author, but the whole thing would be written in phonetic notation.
When we look at phonetic features, the word for nose across the world's languages is much more likely to have a nasal sound, like a n or a m or a ng, or a nasal vowel like on, far more frequently than you would expect by chance. And it just seems like when people think of noses across human languages, they put these sounds in.
Also, if you have a rounded, smooth shape and a sharp, spiky shape, over 95% of people will call the rounded one booba and the spiky one kiki.
That's because we have these associations between particular sounds and particular features in other areas. This is sound symbolism. It gives us this nose phenomenon. It gives us this kiki booba phenomenon. And this sound symbolism pops up in all kinds of places. Our very first guest, Nicole Holliday, shared the fact that this kind of sound symbolism is why in the US there are comparatively more girls' names that end in the small E sound and boys' names that end in N, because we have these sense of small, cute, diminutive, being feminine, and that is shown up in the way that we choose baby names.
That takes us to 37 facts if you're keeping track at home.
In English, when we think about the past and the future, we think about the past being behind us. I have listened to the previous 99 episodes of Lingthusiasm. I think of them as behind me. And when I look forward to the next 99 episodes, I look frontwards into the future. But that's not the mapping that is shared by everyone. Mara speakers in the Andean highlands and Arabic speakers in Morocco have a mapping where the past is in front and the future is behind, which makes sense because we know we have visual understanding of what those previous 99 topics were, but the next 99 topics in Lingthusiasm are a mystery. They're outside of our field of vision.
We can't see them. English actually has two major spatial representations of time. There's the past is behind us, the human body orientation, and also that the past and the future are on a timeline from left to right, which is a writing system-based orientation.
And I love this because it doesn't show up in idioms. You're not like, I'm putting this to the left of this. But it does show up super strongly in our gestures.
There are persistent gestural taboos across many different cultures around the world that say you shouldn't point at rainbows.
Gestures that have a conventionalized name and form, such as thumbs up or finger hearts or a head nod, are known as emblem gestures. These are very different to the kind of on-the-spot spontaneous gestures that we use alongside speech. And one really nifty thing about emblems is they operate over areas that are often quite a lot wider than any one language. So a thumbs up had a really wide circulation across Western Europe and has now become a bit of a global gesture thanks to liking buttons on the internet.
And Italians are often famed for gesturing a lot, but they don't actually gesture more frequently than speakers of other languages. What they do is they tend to move from the shoulder more, so the gestures appear more prominent.
And that takes us up to fact 42.
In the next section, we're going to pull out some classic linguistics example sentences and what they're used for. So if you've taken Ling 100 or you've read a lot of pop linguistics, get out your bingo cards and see how many you recognize.
The horse raced past the barn, fell.
This is an example of a sentence that leads you down a garden path of one interpretation before the word fell makes you reanalyze the syntax of the whole thing. Time flies like an arrow. Fruit flies like a banana.
Flies and like are doing completely different things in these two very similar surface-looking sentences. I shot an elephant in my pajamas. What he was doing in there, I'll never know.
Another classic example of ambiguity from one of the Marx brothers. Colorless green ideas sleep furiously.
Sometimes a sentence can be grammatical, even if it's nonsensical. 'Twas brillig and the slithy toves did gyre and gimble in the wabe.
This is a classic example from Lewis Carroll illustrating that nonsense words can take on a certain grammatical status, a certain meaning, because of the context of the shorter function words like the and of that they're found in between.
When we were doing research for this episode, I don't think I ever fully appreciated that the first time a part of this poem was published in 1955, Lewis Carroll called it a stanza of Anglo-Saxon poetry, and the THs are actually thorns, which is an older English writing convention.
Oh my god, that's such a deep cut.
There is a single Binigunwok word, which is a language from the north end of Australia, and it translates into English as, I cooked the wrong meat for them again.
That's such a great example of languages that, stick a whole bunch of parts together to combine and make one long word. The example I learned was from Turkish, and it literally translates as, are you one of those who we could not Europeanize?
I love that we both have different examples of the same phenomenon.
Yeah.
Who would know aught of art must learn, act, and then take his ease.
This is a sentence that contains all of the vowels in at least some varieties of English. The quick brown fox jumps over the lazy dog.
This is a sentence that contains all of the written characters that we use in written English.
The quick brown fox one is very classic.
Yeah.
There are also some more obscure examples of pangrams in English, like pack my box with 5 dozen liquor jugs from Lingthusiasm favorite book L-O-M-N-O-P.
And Sphinx of black quartz, judge my vow, which can only ever be read with that intonation.
Slightly shorter and far more intimidating.
Indeed.
The lion-eating poet in the stone den is a short narrative poem written in literary Chinese by the Chinese linguist Yuan Renchao in the 1930s as a linguistic demonstration because every word is pronounced shi when written in modern standard Chinese with only the tones differing.
I think that, like, if you don't understand why that's cool without an explanation, I can't help you.
Yeah.
Tear a thin sheet from the yellow pad.
Ah, one of the charmingly anodyne sentences of the Harvard sentences, a list of 720 sentences that combined contain all of the different sound patterns of English so you can use them in speech synthesis.
We read all 720 of them in a bonus ASMR episode.
We sure did. So you can fall asleep to that if you like. It's tuna salad, not salad salad.
This salad is an example of contrastive focus reduplication in English, sometimes known as salad reduplication, because this example is from a famous paper called the salad paper. She spread the bread with socks.
If you play people this sentence while they're wearing a brain scanner, you can see a little predictable spike in the brain processing activity 400 milliseconds after socks, which is very unexpected in this context.
People who do these kind of unexpected sentences always use socks, and I have no idea why.
More people have been to Russia than I have.
This is an example of the comparative illusion. That sounds like a perfectly fine sentence until you actually sit there and try and figure out what it means for more people to have been to Russia than you, who is one person. Buffalo, 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 buffalo. How many buffaloes are there in this sentence? I don't know.
8, I believe. So this is an archetypal sentence that is often quoted as an example of a perfectly cromulent sentence that can contain 8 of the same word.
Always been a tongue twister for me.
But only if you have the verb buffalo, which means to bully.
Okay.
Then it means something like bison, or the plural of buffaloes, from Buffalo, New York, whom bison from Buffalo bully, in turn bully bison from Buffalo. As I have never heard of this verb to buffalo until I encountered the sentence, I have to say it's always rung a bit short for me. But here's a satisfying one from German. Wenn hinter fliegen, 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 hinterher.
And the translation of this is?
When flies fly behind flies, then flies fly in pursuit of flies. Because the word for to fly and the insect fly happen to be identical in German.
Very satisfying. Some of our favorite literary terms?
Ooh, I have to go for Zeugma.
Okay.
So, some examples. Miss Bolo went straight home in a flood of tears and a sedan chair.
So, in a flood of tears and in a sedan chair.
Yes.
But we can put both of those together, even though they're not semantically parallel, they're syntactically parallel.
Exactly. Or, as Alanis Morissette said, you held your breath and the door for me.
2 very different kinds of holding, and yet it kind of works.
It has this sort of charmingly whimsical thing that makes you stop and think for a second, which I enjoy.
Also a shout out to chiasmus, so called because it makes a little X as you shuffle things around 2 parallel sentences. So, champagne for my real friends, real pain for my sham friends.
Named after the Greek letter chi, it has always confused me how to pronounce this word, but we've looked it up and it's chiasmus.
Also, absolutely sounds like a European metal band.
You can go listen to Chiasmus's latest tour. And now we're at 62.
It's time for some language families.
So William Jones, who was the guy who introduced the use of the Greek letter for pi to stand for the, thing about the circle.
Yep.
He was the father of the guy who discovered Proto-Indo-European, aka pi.
Ah.
Also named William Jones. So you can celebrate both William Joneses on Pi Day every year. March 14th.
Celebrate the Pi Guys on Pi Day.
Yeah.
Proto-Indo-European is what we have reconstructed back, but in the current Indo-European family, according to Glottolog, there are currently 586 languages. In contrast, the Austronesian family, which spreads across the Pacific and Indian Ocean region, has 1,274 languages.
And in Papua New Guinea, which is the world's most densely linguistically populated place, there are 840 languages.
Glottolog has 8,604 languages in its current inventory. We know it's hard to pin down what is and isn't a language, but I love that number has grown from about 6,000 when I started reading about linguistics.
Yeah, I think it might have been 6,500 when I started, and our notion of what we consider to be a language or whether 2 related varieties are different languages or dialects of each other continues to grow and evolve. And so these numbers are sort of artificially precise. They do give a sort of a sense of the spread of where a lot of languages are, but they should always be taken with a grain of salt.
Mm-hmm.
I like to think of languages and language families as being sort of like the stars in a very dark night sky. There are about 5,000 stars visible in total from the Earth to the naked eye without telescopes and extra tools like that. And you can see about half of them from any one hemisphere. So if you look up at an incredibly dark night sky and you're seeing the Milky Way, it feels like so many, and there's way more languages than that.
Glottolog lists 227 signed languages, a number that has been rapidly growing as we document the world's diversity of signed languages.
Yeah, I'm sure that's definitely still an undercount. And there are a lot of places where the signed language and the spoken language don't necessarily track onto each other.
Mm-hmm.
One of my favorite examples of which is that American Sign Language is more closely related to French Sign Language than it is to British Sign Language. Because the first American School for the Deaf was founded by a deaf Frenchman, Laurent Clerc, who brought his language over from France and taught it to a lot of deaf students.
Nicole Holliday shares a really cool fact about how there are parallels between a spoken and signed language for a particular group. So African American English and Black ASL share prosodic features. The ASL used by Black Americans uses a larger signing space, which corresponds to the greater pitch variation in African American English.
And Lingthusiasm team member Martha Tsutsui-Billins reminds us that protactile sign languages are a thing. This is sign language in the touch modality used by deafblind people to communicate directly with each other without having an interpreter or something as an intermediary. You can sign directly on someone else's body.
Oh yeah, I know there's an ASL community version in North America, and there's an Auslan tactile sign as well.
Oh, neat.
That brings us up to fact 74.
We've discussed a whole bunch of ways that language happens in your brain and the variation that exists between people. So if you take the prompt, think of your house. What color is it? What materials is it made out of? Mm-hmm. This can be variation in how much mental imagery you have. Some people have very detailed, almost photographic mental images. Some people have sort of sketchier mental image, and some people have zero mental images at all, and they are surprised that they thought people were speaking metaphorically about mental images when some people are speaking literally. And this last group is known as aphantasia, but there's sort of a whole phantasia continuum.
There's also a lot of variation in how you think to yourself. Some people have an inner voice. Sometimes that talks to them a bit, sometimes it talks to them a lot. Other people have detailed imagery, they're high phantasia. Other people have writing or schematic ways of thinking to themselves. And this all falls under a larger variation in inner voice.
There's also variation in terms of thinking about one sense in terms of another. So numbers having color or music making shapes, which is known as synesthesia. And this is a bit different from the sound symbolism where, like, a lot of people associate booba with a round, blobby object, because synesthesia tends to be a bit more arbitrary but consistent within the individual. So if a particular letter is red, then it's always red, but it doesn't necessarily mean something that's inherent to the redness of the letter. I am also synesthete.
Bonus extra fact. The thing I love about all these different ways of understanding how people process thought and language is that it's a really great reminder that language is just one way of expressing our thoughts, that these systems operate with a lot of variation across people and they operate somewhat independently. We can have thoughts without language, whether that's because you're nonverbal or because you're expressing your thoughts through other media like art or dance.
Right, so you may be able to express thoughts via art or something else. And similarly, you can have language that doesn't actually express internal thoughts behind it.
Mm-hmm.
This is why Gen AI or generated artificial intelligence is often called a stochastic parrot, because the parrot also doesn't have thoughts that it's conveying when it says Polly want a cracker. It's just repeating this phrase that it's heard other people use.
On the topic of linguistic birds, can I use this segue into fact 80?
All right, I'll allow it.
Okay. In the International Space Station, to minimize miscommunication, if a English speaker is speaking to a Russian cosmonaut, they will speak in Russian. And if a cosmonaut is speaking to one of the English-speaking team members, they will speak in English. So people use their non-default, non-native language to make sure everyone is best placed to communicate. And in our first episode of Lingthusiasm, we hypothesized that if the International Space Station was to become an isolated and self-managing system, there's a very good chance you'd get a really great English-Russian contact language situation that would be, in fact, a space pidgin.
And that if there were babies born in space, we haven't quite achieved that technology yet, but just for the sake of the hypothesis, that they would transform this contact language variety, this space pidgin, into a space creole and make it more fully fledged and grammaticalized.
I still have my Lingthusiasm drink bottle with a little space pigeon floating around with its helmet in space. Delights me still.
Let's keep going with babies.
Sure.
So this might be handy in space. Babies can drink and breathe at the same time, which we were reminded of by previous guest Jack Jones.
Thanks, Jack.
Adults cannot do this. If you want to try, please watch out for choking.
This doesn't work because we have a flap in our throats known as the epiglottis, which allows us to switch from the breathing tube to the eating tube.
And both adults and babies have this flap, but because the voice box is higher up in babies, they can close the flap to make two totally different tubes, whereas adults have a point where these two tubes have to merge. The baby thing, the higher voice box, is also what chimps still have.
Yeah.
And this makes it harder for chimps to produce the complex vocal sounds that humans have an easier time with. The Australopithecus proto-hominoid Lucy had the same thing as the chimps, this very high voice box. Neanderthals had a voice box that's sort of midway between Lucy and modern humans for larynx position. And so this is one of the things that enabled human spoken language to become as complex as it is, because we can produce so many different sounds.
Also, we still have no idea if the earliest human language was spoken or sign.
We certainly had anatomically modern hands before we had anatomically modern voice boxes, so this could just very well have been the case. The human voice box lowers around age 3 to 6 months, which is also when choking risks increase, so great.
I feel like a lot of very stressed parents are very sensitive to that developmental milestone. I do love, though, that adults treat infant vocalizations as though they are turns in the conversation, and in cultures where there's a practice of high interaction with babies, they'll introduce them to cultural practices around turn taking really, really early.
Babies also babble with the accent of languages they're exposed to. So French babies babble in a more French way, English babies babble in a more English way, and children of deaf adults who are signed to will babble on the hands as well.
Within language development, there is the one-word stage and the two-word stage, but in between them, there is a one-word and one-gesture stage, and this stage heavily predicts how and when the two-word stage will unfold.
Language is multimodal. Even when babies are in utero, and if they're hearing anything, it sounds like things are sort of underwater, they can tell different people and languages apart before they're born.
When I was pregnant, I went around telling people that I was temporarily plural.
Yeah, I made you a onesie that said Little Longitudinal Language Acquisition Project. Both your kids have now worn.
Indeed.
And it's also in the Lingthusiasm store for if your linguist friend has a kid.
I mean, I love that linguists will absolutely put their kids in these onesies, but I also love that if you ask linguists what their favorite word is, you're very likely to have at least one in a group say their favorite word is In fact, we got 2 related facts from previous guests.
Bethany Gardner said, if someone uses or like before a word, it's probably a sign that they're talking about something that's harder to describe.
And Daniel from Because Language shared a completely different paper that says, when you say before a word, people will remember it better.
So helps with both production and comprehension. Also from the Because Language podcast, Hedvig said, when we take turns in conversation, the gap between two people is less than the time we know it takes to plan what you're going to say. So people have already started thinking about what they want to say before the other person has finished.
This happens at such quick time intervals. Even in these quick intervals, sometimes the reason a conversation can feel unbalanced is because Different people have different conversational styles that differ by fractions and fractions of seconds. Some people prefer really high overlap, and some people prefer to have more distinct space between speakers while they're taking turns.
This was a favorite fact of the reviewer who put Lingthusiasm in the New York Times a little while ago. Not that we're bragging.
And as a related fact, we're both high overlap speakers, and we're very grateful to our editorial team for smoothing that over.
We're now at 96.
There are two common strategies for innovative gender-neutral language in common use. The first is expanding the domain of applicability for one feature that's already gender-neutral. So Spanish and Portuguese with the E, as in todes, from estudiantes. Or you can put all the endings on the same word, like German innen or French celleux.
As a third option, sometimes people will invent a completely different pronoun to use. These are referred to as neopronouns, and neo means new, but there are attested neopronouns from over 150 years ago. Z-E, as a gender-neutral English pronoun, dates back to at least 1864.
We are at 98, and we have two facts that are 100-themed to finish out our show.
The first one from former guest Randall Monroe is, my favorite fact is that the German word hundred and the Roman word cent both come from the same older word that began with a K sound, which underwent different sound shifts in different language branches. The Russian and Farsi words for hundred, sto and sad, are related to cent and hundred as well. They're all the same word from different sides of an even older pronunciation shift in Indo-European. This was my first exposure to the idea that such different sounding words could be connected in deep time in a way that we could actually figure out.
Fact 100. There is a word long hundred, which means 120.
This number is also known as the Great Hundred or 12t because it used to be the default hundred in Germanic languages. And then when the Latinate hundred, which is, five 20s, 5 score, instead of 6 20s or 6 score, was introduced and became more popular, they were referred to for a while as the long hundred and the short hundred.
Right.
The long thousand was 10 long hundreds, so 1200.
Right.
And you might wonder, well, how do they refer to the short hundred if 100 was 5 20s?
Mm-hmm.
And the answer to this is they had 10t and 11t.
Oh, how novel.
A lot of people these days associate 11t with Lord of the Rings.
Yeah.
But this is because J.R.R. Tolkien was the kind of scholar who was like, yeah, I'm totally going to use the long hundred system within Lord of the Rings.
I'm bringing the long hundred back. If we try really hard to make the long hundred happen, we can do this all again in 20 episodes' time.
All right, everybody, let's see if we can do it in the next 20 months. Often on Lingthusiasm, we like to do a really deep dive. One or two of these fun facts could be expanded into a whole episode. But there is something fun about occasionally doing this whistle-top tour.
It's been so fun to share just some of the many reasons that we're enthusiastic about linguistics in this episode. Because it is our 100th episode, we'd really love it if you help us share the enthusiasm about linguistics.
We hope that even more people can reach this linguistics enthusiasm if you give this episode a share with a linguistics fact or story or other interesting thing that you like, whether it's from this episode, you can pick a favorite, or just an extra bonus thing that we didn't get to since there are so many reasons to be enthusiastic about linguistics. And we're looking forward to the next 100 with you. For more Lingthusiasm and links to all the things mentioned in this episode, go to lingthusiasm.com. You can listen to us on all of the podcast platforms or lingthusiasm.com. You can get transcripts of every episode on lingthusiasm.com/transcripts, and you can follow @Lingthusiasm on all the social media sites. You can get scarves with lots of linguistics patterns on them, including the IPA, branching tree diagrams, Booba and Kiki, our favorite esoteric Unicode symbols, and a little Gavagai rabbit, plus other Lingthusiasm merch like Etymologies and Destiny t-shirts, buttons that say, ask me about linguistics, and aesthetic IPA posters at lingthusiasm.com/merch. Links to my social media can be found at gretchenmcculloch.com. My blog is allthingslinguistic.com, and my book about internet language is called Because Internet.
My social media and blog is Superlinguo. Lingthusiasm is able to keep existing thanks to the support of our patrons. If you want to get an extra Lingthusiasm episode to listen to every month our entire archive of bonus episodes to listen to right now, or if you just want to help the show keep running way past 100 episodes ad-free, go to patreon.com/Lingthusiasm or follow the links from our website. Patrons can also get access to our Discord chat room to talk with other linguistics fans and be the first to find out about new merch and other announcements. Recent bonus topics include deleted scenes from recent interviews, a linguistics travelogue, and a crossover interview where the team from Let's Learn Everything ask Gretchen all of their linguistics questions. If you can't afford to pledge, that's okay too. We also really appreciate it if you can recommend Lingthusiasm to anyone in your life who's curious about language, especially this month in honour of our 100th episode.
Lingthusiasm is created and produced by Gretchen McCulloch and Lauren Gawne. Our senior producer is Claire Gawne. Our editorial producer is Sarah Dopierala. Our production assistant is Martha Tsutsui-Billins. And our editorial assistant is John Crook. Our music is Ancient City by The Triangles.
Stay Lingthusiastic.